Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me again. It's to be here 3 times in a row is a great privilege. And one of the things I love about this conference and what you do is that you have a unique talent for bridging divides and bringing people together who wouldn't normally hear one another, who wouldn't normally speak to one another. People from the worlds of academia, from business, from philanthropy, and the non-governmental sector. And what always encourages me coming here, why I'm keen to come back, is that I always get the feeling that we're working in the same way, that a lot of we're coming to a lot of the same conclusions. So what I want to talk about today is the implications of this new diplomacy, or what we're calling the new diplomacy, for nation-state behavior. And I'm positing the existence of a new kind, or recognition of a new kind, or a newly significant kind of security for a nation-state, which I'm calling reputational security. But I'll get there in a moment to explain what I mean. In my talk, what I want to talk about first of all is the way in which old ideas are playing out in dangerous times and are not fitted to the times in which we live. And this builds on some of the remarks that Scott has made. I then want to posit what I see as the new rules that come from the concept of reputational security. I'll also talk to some of the other priorities that I think nation-states and other international actors have to bear in mind right now. And then I'll come to some conclusions. I should say that my remarks are part of the conclusion of my own book, and unfortunately I haven't got copies for everybody, but there is a flyer, so you can buy a discounted copy when it becomes available in 2 weeks' time. So sorry it isn't available for the conference. The first thing I see in many nation states around the world is a failure to listen, a failure to pay attention to what's happening in other places, and a great turn inwards and a great focus on a illusion of the past. I think that statesmen are arguing for stability based on a fantasy of history. And you can see how this failure to listen is borne out by the way in which people's Twitter profile works. It's very common to see somebody who is tweeting an awful lot, but when you look to see who they're following very, very few people. In fact, they might be following no one. The person that comes to mind, actually, is one of, to be a, what we call a bipartisan critic here for a moment, the person who did a lot of tweeting on behalf of Hillary Clinton during the first Obama administration was not following any foreigners. And he was supposed to be communicating with foreigners, but he wasn't following any. Why? Because he wasn't listening to them. He was projecting. He was using an instrument of dialogue as an instrument of monologue. And I see this as being very dangerous. Beyond this, we see a tremendous disconnect in terms of policies. People are disconnecting from alliances, and my own country is a prime example of that at the moment. We see public diplomacy, which historically has been one of the mechanisms in which people have come to understand one another, playing as a kind of performance for domestic consumption. And I was thinking of the way in which the Chinese government paid millions and millions of dollars to advertise in Times Square, but not because they actually wanted Americans to see anything about China. They wanted to be able to report back home in China, see how your government can put up pictures of Chinese people in Times Square. Americans had no idea what the images represented or who they were being shown. So a great opportunity for real dialogue was lost in the name of propaganda. I see a mismatch between the way in which we talk about identity in the world today, and the realities of people living their lives in many different countries, crossing many boundaries in the course of one lifetime, having loyalties to one place and many places. And we pretend that lives are much simpler than they really are. And so I see it as being essential to pay attention to people, the transnational realities of life today. Unfortunately, when it comes to the nation state looking to find a stability, looking to assert its identity in the world, you see a great emphasis on a rather narrow idea of national identity, where people say our country is simply terrific. Don't you wish your country was hot like mine? Haven't I got a wonderful place that I come from? And Britain is very proud of this, going around with our great campaign. And okay, there's something to be said for this. It generates revenue for the country. But my feeling is that the true cost of a very narrow concept of national identity asserted in a branding campaign, the true cost is not what you pay for the poster or not what you pay for the creative who comes up with the concept. The cost is in the opportunity to partner with other people, because you're putting yourself, your own country, or your own place forward as this paragon that can't partner with anyone. That's the problem. And so for Britain right now, our problem is we have such an idea of ourselves as being an exceptional place that half the population doesn't want to be part of a partnership with the largest market in the world on our back door. And this is a deeply divisive issue in the country, but I think speaks to a problem of what the costs may be of having a very narrow concept of a national purpose. I'm also concerned that within this very narrow understanding of the nation and its purposes, you see an attempt to use electronic media, but to win a kind of victory. Scholars have done a good job of explaining that the mechanisms of social media are about building relationships. But then when the nation state gets hold of these mechanisms and says, right now we want to use these mechanisms to win our relationships, we have a problem. Because the desire to win your relationships, that is a definition of psychosis. And what we need rather is to look to see, or how can we use these mechanisms to identify and explore win-win scenarios, to have dialogue, to learn from one another and think, well, what is the best way to build a common and collaborative future? So, where does this idea of reputational security that I'm putting forward come from? Well, I think that this is one of those what we call the polite green men who appeared in Ukraine in 2014 and became part of the loss of provinces in Ukraine to Russia. And I started thinking about what had gone wrong in Ukraine, why there wasn't a great outcry that provinces had been cut off a sovereign country. And I realized that those of us who'd been thinking about soft power and the way in which countries accumulate a good reputation in the world by doing interesting, impressive, cultural or industrial things, that we'd got something wrong. We'd thought about soft power as some kind of extra, that for the country that has everything, why not have soft power too? Why not be famous for your universities or share your theater or music with the world and have that little extra, soft power? But soft power is not a luxury for the wealthiest countries. At the other end of the spectrum, for a vulnerable country, it is an essential ingredient. The problem for Ukraine is that the countries of Western Europe had no sense of Ukraine as being distinct from its former Soviet history. it had not taken off in our minds as a place with its own culture, as a place that had admirable characteristics. And in part, they weren't doing so much that was admirable. They had a massive corruption problem, and they had yet to really establish Western European standards or universal standards of respect for human rights. So because they didn't have a reputation, there was no outcry. Rather, the narrative that came from the Kremlin about Ukraine being a legitimate place of uncertain sovereignty, where provinces could be chopped off and given back to Russia, this could be accepted. People in the West couldn't even agree the name of the country, and it was very, very common to use the term the Ukraine, which was the traditional Russian way of talking about the country, meaning the border, not seeing it as a sovereign state in its own right. So reputation is part of security. How do you get this reputation? Well, being relevant to your neighbor for any reason helps. We know that. But if you can be relevant for being a good country, we know that is more important than either being relevant as a rich country or being relevant as a strong country. Social scientists have done polls to look at what populations around the world admire, and it's clear that being good is much more important than being rich or strong. And part of that goodness could be being culturally relevant, having things that people admire and wish to participate in. But I think the best kind of relevance is an ethical relevance, being seen to adhere to the kind of standards of human rights that have emerged from the Golden Rule that Scott was talking about. And the ethical standards which he talked about were absolutely part of the framing of the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights. But it wasn't just coming from monotheistic cultures, it was also coming from Confucian culture, from many other kinds of culture around the world, had these same standards, and being relevant to those standards, having ethical relevance when you are a government, I think that is essential. But also, in a world where the problems are bigger than any one country can solve, and this is a point that Marjorie made last night. When the problems of the world are too big for any one country, then it's going to take a partnership between countries and a partnership between different kinds of international actors to solve the problem. And so I think that part of a good reputation is being able to be part of a team and seeking to be known as a good team player rather than as always the soloist. However, as I said earlier, some national brands, some concepts of national identity limit partnership. If some people feel their country is too special to take advice or be part of a partnership with other countries, and sometimes in a country it flips. There have been times when Britain has been a great partner country. Right now, we're letting down our partners. At other points, we've been a great partner. I hope, for my own country, that it will, as we move forward, as the old song says, accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, and don't mess with Mr. In Between. One of the things I found looking at national reputations is that they take a long, long time to build. And one of the most precious things for any international actor is a reputation. You cannot expect a reputation to accumulate overnight. But the good part is that even if you deviate from that reputation for a small period of time, you find that when you return to type, people forget about the things that have gone wrong. And case in point, the reputation of Canada has not been affected by 10 years of stepping back from a traditional role of being a good citizen country. The Harper years were looking for a different kind of Canada, a kind of a dig it up and sell it ethic. But that hasn't affected the international standing of Canada. It takes a long time for people to notice a change, and if you change back quickly enough, the world might not realize things were different. One of the points that I want to get to with reputational security is that adherence to human rights is part of the core business of building your reputation. A number of countries around the world say, oh, we would love to respect human rights, but we have a problem with security. We are too vulnerable to have journalists walking free in the streets. They belong safely tucked away in jail. And I think that by talking about the relationship between reputation and adherence to standards of human rights, we might not fix the problem, but we will raise the price for the abusers of human rights. And there is not enough attention being given to certain countries who have outrageous records especially on the issue of media freedom. There are other things that we need to do in this rather unstable historical period in which we've suddenly been pitched. In my conclusion to my book, I talk about the need to contest disinformation, to build media freedom and enhance democratic structures around the world. I see a lot of the political problems as stemming from victim narratives, people believing that their nation has suffered above and beyond any other nation in the history of the world, and some nations have, but if we're all obsessing on our own victimhood, we have zero empathy for everybody else or anybody else, and a perception in our own carte blanche to do whatever is necessary for security at the expense of others. So finding a mechanism to counter these victim narratives I see as a priority. And I also, to refer to my remarks this time last year, I also feel that it's essential that we develop visions of the future that are so attractive that people can defer some of the narrow national self-aggrandizement in the name of advancing the collective benefit. My conclusion is we need to weigh the true price of nation branding, build alternative identities through collaboration. And I see this as beginning as with a real process of listening. And we need to understand as we listen to others, they'll tell us stuff about ourselves, and it might not be pleasant to hear how other people perceive us. In fact, this process of listening to what others think about us can often be deeply unsettling. But I think that when we listen to people in the world and they talk about our hypocrisy and they talk about our own restrictions on freedom of speech or human rights, the worst thing that we can then do is then confirm what they're saying through our deeds. I'm concerned when I talk to people in the UK, when I've talked to leaders and officials in Western Europe, that we are very comfortable with the language of human rights because we've imposed the geography on it. And I do not believe that human rights has a home country. I don't believe it has a geography. And I think we do an immense disservice to those concepts when we talk about them as having a geographical specificity. Everybody falls short of these standards, and as soon as we become complacent with these standards, we are leaving them vulnerable to, leaving ourselves vulnerable to being called out for hypocrisy, and we're making it easier for those who do not wish to be restrained by human rights to talk about their human rights, and to single out the discourse of the Kremlin, to single out the discourse of the government in Beijing. They will disown the international covenants of human rights that they have agreed to in the past and say, oh, those were written for us. We don't have a place in the origin of those. That is European, or that is North American. It's not part of our tradition. We emphasize other things. And I think that we must contest that, but part of the contestation is to be honest about our own failings. Remember, there are no frontiers restraining problems. And in the same way, there can be no frontiers restraining the solutions. The only hope is in our ability to partnership with each other. We can't expect to be admired outside our own borders if we only look after our own citizens. We have to be our brothers and our sisters' keeper. And I think that is a great challenge. But I'm hopeful because I see that in an agenda based around human rights and partnership, we can connect with one another for good. But we need to at least identify where things are going wrong and talk about alternative ways of imagining a collective community of international practice. So that's the book cover, that's my Twitter handle and my email, and I think we've just got a couple of minutes for questions, but please contact me if you want to continue a discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, Susan, please.
You alluded to the fact that you were here last year since I wasn't.
Okay.
How do you feel about what's transpired in the year when you have Steve Bannon out in the world bringing the opposite of everything you suggested?
Yeah, well, I think it would be easy for us to pick out particular people. The problem with these people is not that they're teaching us to hate. The problem is that they are taking ideas we've always thought, or many people have always thought, and they're giving them a legitimacy in the wider world. And to me, that's the problem. It's not the individuals, it's the masses who feel justified and who feel affirmed by what those individuals are saying. I'm startled by the way in which, rather than people connecting to do good in the world, they seem instead to be connecting and reaffirming one another to emphasize what I see as the most negative instincts, the opposite of what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, which would be, the worst devils of our nature. And that there can be a sort of an unholy alliance, and Steve Bannon's been part of this, so encouraging the far-right groups to connect with one another and say, oh, let's all help each other out. And it's a little bit, I'm challenged by this, but in my heart I remain an optimist, and maybe it's silly to write an optimistic book right now, but I think there's a pendulum swing, and it'll swing back, and when it swings back, people are going to want something to read, right? So why not anticipate the market, right?
You can always count on me to promote your book. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by China. China in particular is doing a number of the things that you've said do not build reputational security.
Yes.
They're doing things that build reputational insecurity, yet they are getting stronger and richer. At what point does that start to cost them and their place in the world?
I think it costs them as we start to talk about what's going on, and as the fact that China's picking up the check shouldn't prevent us from saying that they're doing wrong. I see China as much more of a problem than Russia. I think because Russia's a 20-year threat, it's a disruptor, it's moving forward by spoiling, by sort of knocking over the chess pieces, but China is repositioning the chess pieces and has a long goal, and it's important that we pay attention to the Chinese people who dissent and who feel differently and who feel alienated and who feel that the promises of Chinese history have been let down. And I'm very moved by the story of P.C. Chang, the Chinese scholar who contributed to the Universal Declaration in Human Rights. And I think, this is somebody that we should be telling stories about, that we should have statues to, that we should remember, we should have films about, but we allow the people on our side or who affirm the things we care about from these societies to be forgotten, and pay much more attention to the people who are working against the collective interest. So that's, but I think you're absolutely right to focus on that as an issue. Right.
And that is, there is one overarching issue which could collectively bring people together, and that is the sustainability of the earth.
Right.
And the fact that there are increasingly issues that could impact the survival of the earth. And
Right.
that's apolitical.
Yes.
And that could be a very interesting rallying cry.
Yes.
I was at a conference 2 days ago at Columbia University, and it was about the fact that international trade, in fact, has increased fourfold in the past 30 years. So despite all of this political fractionalism, there still is a collective need to sustain, to value the resources that we have left, because we're all going to perish. And maybe that's the overarching theme that could collectively.
Absolutely. And I think that we can see from, again, if you ask people around the world about what the great issues are, there is some consensus about the issues. And absolutely, climate is one of the issues that people care about. But even more than climate, education is an issue, and we can partner around education in quite a non-controversial way. Difficult to work with governments. So I do see hope in collaboration around these issues. But we have to have collaboration without a flag. We have to be collaborating to solve the issue, not to perform the wonderfulness of our nation state. Yes, yes.
Well, thank you
I think
very
that's
much.
it.